Warning, this podcast contains spoilers for the first Avatar and the sequel, Avatar: Way of Water, in theaters now. Folks, let's talk about it. We saw it in 3D, which I will say, and you mentioned, the 3D is really great.
It's very immersive. It was much more 3D than the first one, which I
agree.
Am a fan of.
And it's not just dumb, oh, look, now the arrow is pointing right at your face. It's stuff like...
But they do add a bit of that in, which I like.
They do have a little bit of that in, but it's not just that wow kind of stuff of Quaritch's gun is pointing directly at you, or the beak of his flying beast is coming out of the screen. It's more as they're underwater,
that's the stuff that really got me.
Yeah, you see these motes of light and different substances just
and they're floating
in the theater. Yeah, floating past
that's
you.
The coolest stuff.
And it really feels like you're underwater. It was really cool.
Yeah, that to me was my favorite new development in this movie. I am not the biggest original Avatar stan, and I cannot say that this film has turned me into one, but I was very immersed in that spectacle and experience, especially for me, the immersive 3D. I really enjoy that experience, and I'd love to see that, in all different kinds of movies. So that was a big selling point for me.
Rosie, do you think people need to see this movie, need to see the first Avatar before they see Avatar: Way of Water?
You know what? I don't think it's a full necessity, because I feel like the opening of the movie does a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to introducing the characters, introducing the family, introducing Jake's journey. I would also say that this movie follows a lot of similar thematic beats as the first movie. So I think that you can really understand the world of Avatar. But I will say that I do think that if you wanted to rewatch it and also see whether you were a fan, because I feel like this is very much if you really like the first movie, you're probably going to really like or love this movie. So it's also a good kind of watermark, but I don't necessarily think it's a necessity to see the first one before coming into this. I do think that if you're going to do it, probably watch the first one before you see this, because once you've watched this one, the graphics of the first one look very dated.
Oh, yeah, very, very, very dated. I'll say this. I think if you wanted to go back and just kind of refresh, or you haven't seen the first Avatar, what you need to do is watch the first 30 minutes of the first Avatar, because you need to understand how the Avatar technology works, what it is.
That's a great point.
How Jake came to be in the Na'vi body, where the Na'vi bodies come from. And, there are various scenes like the torture of Spider that kind of hinge on the audience's understanding of how the kind of Avatar and the high technology of this age of humanity's ability to peer into the human brain, how, what they can do with that technology. And so I think it's important to kind of have that as an understanding of the world and the kind of world building of it, how the human race came to be on Pandora, how they get there, how far it is away, why they're there. I think all that stuff happens basically in the first half hour, 45 minutes of the 3-hour plus epic of Avatar #1, 2009's Avatar. And if you didn't have 3 hours plus to carve out, then just watch the first 30 to 45 minutes of the first Avatar to kind of understand the reality of where we are. And the rest of it, you'll understand. There's a bad guy. It's basically Dances with Wolves in space. Only this time, the indigenous win.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Let's talk about something, because you say that, right? And that immediately makes me feel we talked a lot about the way that Andor dealt with real life analogous storytelling that felt radical, but you made a really great point in the lead up to this episode about your reading of the accessibility of Avatar. And could you speak a little bit to that?
Oh, sure. I just think James Cameron is truly a master filmmaker, a truly master storyteller in a medium that is basically box office blockbuster. That is his milieu. He understands how to create a story that crosses all kinds of national, ideological, and political lines to create a story that is accessible to the biggest possible audience ever. This is one of the 5 movies this year, American films, that's going to open in China, right? They think it's going to do 200 million in China. Why is that? It's because he's able to gesture at all these different kinds of groups and concerns that different groups have about stories in this extremely fractured political era that we're living in, and create something like unified out of it. And there's something almost diabolical about it. So this is what I mean. This is what I mean. On the one hand, like, we live in an age in which I think people rightly and fairly are concerned about diversity, about depictions of diversity, and they want to see themselves reflected on screen. So here is a story about an indigenous people, right? An indigenous group. They're essentially underdogs. At the same time, so that gives you like entree. They don't look like us, right? They have different ways of being. They're very connected to nature in a way that feels like, and at times almost simplistic mapping of indigenous concerns and an indigenous character onto a sci-fi character. At the same time, this is a group that also reaches like across, that has an appeal beyond that kind of, a kind of narrow sliced appeal, because they're a unified ethno-religious group, right? They have, and their religion is at the center of their existence. So they're very religious, mono culture, and they have very, very traditional gender roles. Like, at one point, Jake says a father's role is to protect. This film opens with Jake teaching Natayam, his oldest son, like how to fish. And meanwhile, it's like Natiri, his wife, whose the bow and arrow is her thing. Like, she is an absolute fucking artist with the bow and arrow. And that is, in fact, in this movie, that's like her calling card. Like, Quaritch is able to identify like her by her arrows. But it's Jake who's teaching the kids to hunt, not Natiri who's doing it. Natiri, not to say that, but at the same time, she is a warrior. She is a fierce warrior. By that same token, we see her like preparing food in a very traditional kind of way, like in the huts, chopping up fish and preparing stuff for the family life, an act we never see Jake doing, right? So it's able to appeal to people who care about diversity, and also people who are like, there's too much diversity in this world. It's able to open in China, right? Because who are the fucking bad guys in this movie? The American military. The American corporate and military interests are the bad guys in this film. And why can it open in America also? Because who's the good guy in this film? An American soldier, a white guy. The greatest Na'vi in the history of Na'vi is a white man named Jake. We love shit like that. And so it's really interesting the way he is like crafted this story that just has absolutely massive universal appeal, not just to people like who love movies, quote unquote, the way they used to be, but people who care about like about representation and things now. Like, that is. It's diabolical what he's done. It's really crazy what he's done. And it absolutely works. Like, is there a cynical element to it? Yeah, I think so, yes. At the same time, like when Payokan starts wrecking shop and hurling whalers like into the water and slapping them with his tail so that their bodies just like fucking go ragdolling across the deck, and then the Na'vi show up and start spearing dudes like out of their quadcopters. I'm like, fuck yeah, kill them. Absolutely, let's kill these fucking bastards. Please, like, kill them all. I love it. So this shit really works. Like, it's amazing, and there's a through line with a lot of the stuff that James Cameron has cared about for basically his entire filmmaking career, which is, militarism, the effects, the wide-ranging effects of corporate power, the effects of capitalism outside of the view of the kind of the general public. Like it's always like, what happens when a corporation goes to space with military power? Mm-hmm. What happens when a corporation, is mining off-world, as in Aliens? It's like, what happens when they're placing colonies on another world? What happens when they're mining outside of the view of the press and stuff like that? This is like the kind of shit he cares about. What happens when technology runs amok? This is the stuff that James Cameron cares about. And of course, we all know he absolutely loves the oceans. This guy
he loves
the
submarine.
oceans.
Loves that.
So it's really incredible what he has done here.
Yeah, I think that your point is so astute about that wide appeal. I think that's why, for some people like myself, it's not always going to hit, because the vagaries or the lack of making a solid commitment to a message or a story, And I also, something that I struggle with after watching last night the ABC 2020 special Avatar, The Deep Dive, about making this movie, I think that there is a very interesting conversation to be had by different people than me, but I will be seeking it out. The way that the Na'vi have always been very coded towards like different races.
Yeah.
But then the people that are brought in to play the characters, like I was very surprised to find that the wife, Renal, who's the wife of the Metkani, the water people's leader, again, she's the wife and he's the husband and he's the leader. She's played by Kate Winslet, even though they're very obviously inspired visually by the Maori and Maori communities. Now, her husband is played by a Maori actor. But there's just some things like that for this, and the kind of the choices that they make in representing this kind of alien indigenous community that just doesn't really sit for me. But I will say it does follow many of the traditions of things that we love about comic books. It is an analogous story. It's just now we're living in a great time. 2022 has been an amazing year for indigenous entertainment made by indigenous people, whether it's Spirit Rangers on Netflix or Prey or, which wasn't made by an indigenous person, but had a lot of indigenous people working on it, including the producer. Also, obviously Reservation Dogs.
Yeah.
So I think like that puts it into a different light. I feel like this is still a very 2009 story, even in 2022. And I think that for me shines through a little bit more narratively because of the other entertainment that we kind of get to imbibe in the stories that we get to experience. But it's a wild spectacle and an absolute feat of kind of showing what you can do with CGI. I also like to think this movie took 13 years to get made.
Yeah.
I like to think that it's like I hope that this is not wrong and there won't be horror stories coming out, but I like to think that this is like the most sustainable CG heavy movie that's ever been made, and that everyone who worked on it got like a long time to do all the effects and everything, because like that's the horrible thing about watching a Marvel movie or a DC movie, a Star Wars movie. You hear all these horror stories about the incredible VFX artists just being run into the ground, and I love the idea that James Cameron's just like chilling, taking his time, giving everyone like a really good amount of time to work on the movie. This seems like a very James Cameron move.
It really does. This movie needs to make over $1 billion just to like break even. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be something to watch.
Yeah, post-COVID, how do you think that's going to go? Because we are in a different cinematic landscape.
I think this movie is going to make. I think it's going to make billions of dollars. I think it's going to do it again because I think. I was struck when I was doing my research for rewatch of Avatar ahead of watching Way of Water, how wide-ranging the appeal of that movie was. There was like a story from 2009 of these Palestinian protesters dressed up like they had painted their bodies like Na'vi, and again you have this story that appeals to people who feel like they fall on either side of the various conversations about imperialism and colonialism, to name one of the many dualities that this movie manages to straddle, and these two movies manages to straddle. It's honestly really crazy that he's managed to do this. And I feel the same way about you in terms of like the Maori codedness. Obviously the first one, when I was rewatching it the other night, it is like striking how American indigenous coded it is. Like, it's not even, you can't even see coded, because it basically is like from the war yelps to the casting of Wes Studi to, this is what it is, And
it falls into like the strange, like the one thing that I think I saw some reviewers kind of astutely point this out, but like the costume designs, they lean into this strange like sexualization of the characters even. And that I think is something that feels more in line of that outdated kind of coding of how those characters were often portrayed. So it's those little things that I think, but you know what? If it gets people to feel a little bit more thoughtful about this stuff, that's always a good thing.
Now, I will say that I think I liked it. Clearly, I liked it more than you. I had a good time because, for me, it's like the story is whatever. I feel the same way about the first Avatar. It's like that movie opens up and half an hour into it, it's like, okay, I understand what's happening here.
Yes, it's
who
not
the bad
subtle.
guys are. Yeah, this is not a subtle movie. And it's the same thing with Way of Water. This is not a movie where, you get to the end of Act 2 and you can feel the story mechanisms working adequately so that like the villains, you hate them more than anything else in the world, and you want the heroes to just like whoop their asses, and you understand that this movie is going to give it to you. There's never a moment where you're like, this movie's not going to give me that heroes kicking the villains' asses moment. So I enjoyed it for the spectacle, and because there's almost something, again, mathematical, architectural about the amount of kind of thought that Cameron has put into crafting a story that, super producer Saul and I were talking about like tropes of sci-fi and how many various tropes of sci-fi and storytelling writ large that the Avatar series uses, that it's really beyond tropes the way this story and Cameron is able to take themes and things that different groups care about and kind of like boil them down into the most universal like ideals that people hold. Like, it's important to protect the family, and that your land is worth defending, that people should have a connection to their community, that religion is important and is worth respecting, that, unchecked consumerism that destroys cultures is bad, and at the same time, there are a lot of things here. Like, I'm interested to see what the response from the Maori community is. Like, there are a lot of things here where I'm like, gosh, I wonder how people are going to feel and talk about this. Because again, it feels like,
I'm very interested to see that.
It feels like the most consciously apolitical movie that we've seen, certainly in a long time. Now, the thing that I do like about this movie, actually love about this movie, is that we haven't had a smoke a big joint and just like sit back movie.
That's the only way to watch the movie. Absolutely.
We have not had one of those in a long time. Like, the MCU movies, you kind of have to understand what happened in like 33 other films. There hasn't been like an epic just like get baked and enjoy the visuals movie in a long time. And in that sense, I actually quite liked Avatar. And again, when the Na'vi in the third act start striking back, the story mechanisms absolutely worked on me. And I was like, yes, show me in slow-mo, 60 frames a second detail. Show me a Na'vi grab a guy by the head and throw them off the ship into the water. Show me a Na'vi hitting them in the face with their bows. Show
somebody's hand getting chopped off in 3D and coming towards you into the water.
Show me Payokan like fucking bouncing explosive harpoon off his metal skull plate
That
was pretty badass. So that it hits another boat and those soldiers go flying. Like, that part of it was really cool. But I will, again, there's a way to look at the way this entire story is structured and feel like there's just like a lot of cynicism here.
The funniest thing is, right, I think talking to you about it, as always, has enlightened me. I think one of the major reasons that I didn't love the first one, and I still have not been fully converted, though I did enjoy this one more with the visuals. You know what? I do not enjoy war movies. They are not something I've ever particularly enjoyed. There's obviously exceptions of movies that are like masterpieces, like All Quiet on the Western Front and Come See and stuff like that. But like generally a militarized movie about like giant people and they're well, if it was giants, that would be cool. But like big guys and they got guns and they're killing a bunch of people. That's never appealed to me. And those were actually the moments, the militarization aspects, even though they are portrayed negatively. And I do love to see the American military very negatively.
Quite negatively.
That to me, the stuff where I'd feel myself really getting immersed is like swimming under the water and seeing some cool creatures. And then as soon as it got back to the like violence and the military and stuff, that's kind of where I would lose my immersion in the movie and my kind of enjoyment. So I think that's it, is in some ways, and this is the nature of the movie, it's a war movie, it's an anti-war movie, but through the lens of here are the horrors of war. And in this case, that is not necessarily what I'm looking for. In a way, I kind of like the aspects of it where it feels more like I used to go to the IMAX a lot. When I was a kid in London, they have a big IMAX theater there that for a long time was the biggest one in the world. And you could go and pay like $5 or $6 and see a 25-minute to 45-minute long movie that was made specifically to show off the IMAX. And it would be, I saw ones about like the X Games, I saw ones about dinosaurs, I saw one about Under the Sea. And there was a lot of moments in this where I was just like, I just wanted to lose myself in that huge spectacle of the vibe and experience a different world. And this does deliver that at certain points. But there's just things that were kind of taking me out of it. And I think it's that aspect of a story about war. I've always found that hard to connect with, even, you know, throughout my life as a film lover. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting conversation piece. And I think the conversations about it will be far more complex and long running than the kind of meme of the original Avatar, which was kind of like, oh, it's forgettable, even though it's the biggest movie in the world. This feels like there's going to be a lot more kind of in-depth conversation had about it.
Let's talk about Spider. So Spider, we must talk about Spider. So Spider, again, the son, the biological son of Colonel Quaritch. He's raised on Pandora. He is both part of their world and not part of their world. He puts on blue body paint in a way that feels, you know, both a nod and a kind of, there's some, you know, like a nod to the culture that he is immersed in, but also feels like weirdly, it just feels weird that he's like doing that.
Yeah.
And Quaritch captures him, and then he is tortured, which is awful. But then kind of bonds with his father in an interesting way. And again,
even though, so we just need to say, like, James Cameron in Avatar 2, Way of Water, goes out of his way many times to say he is not technically the biological son of this Quaritch, because this Quaritch is like a random avatar. He is the biological son of the other Quaritch, who all of his brain matter memories and on a USB drive went into the avatar. So they do have a connection, but they don't. And they play on that a lot to kind of do this like moral gray area where you're like, will they look after each other? Will they not? And they do, obviously.
And so Spider really becomes Quaritch's begrudging at times, but really right-hand person. Like, he helps with translations. He teaches them how to bond with animals using their braids. And in a moment that I think actually burns the character, because all throughout Spider, you can tell, is empathizing with the various, Na'vi who are being brutalized by Quaritch's military forces in their search for Jake. He stops at various times his father from just like flat out murdering the Na'vi, like just to find Jake and to like send a message. But after the kind of like climactic battle between Jake and Quaritch under the water, where Jake chokes out Quaritch, Spider, who has entered the wreck of this whaling vessel, sees his father in Na'vi form there drowning, and decides, fuck it, I'm going to save him. And it's a weird moment because on the one hand, this story is like wants you to feel for Spider as a being without a home, without a father.
Yeah.
His only father figure is not his father. He feels more at home amongst an alien species who don't who are very, very kind and accepting to him.
But don't fully embrace him as a family member.
They don't fully embrace him, right? They're never mean to him in any kind of way.
Is colder, but the kids see him as a sibling.
Right.
But really it's only Kiri
who truly embraces him, right? And for him to save the life of their tormentor for reasons...
It just has to be narrative reasons. That's the only...
Yes, but sure. I mean, like, obviously, it's because... No, because there isn't even the narrative reasons.
No. I mean, because they want him to be in the movie next time.
But that doesn't even make sense because they've already established at the beginning of this movie that the death doesn't matter. Just upload another fucking version of Colonel Quaritch that's saved on the hard drive into another Na'vi body and fucking be done with it. You don't need him. He can die.
I really felt that choice, which is hilarious because, like, Spider, I mean... To me, that's a classic, like, it's almost become a trope, the, like, young sidekick, human sidekick that kind of annoys people. But the funny thing is, the moment that I found most powerful in this whole film, in its message about family, was when Spider turned up. He's at the end of the movie, he's on the ship, he's obviously been in cahoots with Quaritch and everything, but the moment he sees his Na'vi siblings, the people who he's been raised with, he wants to help them, he helps them, and not for a single second do any of them question why he was with them, judge him. They're just like, we're happy you're here, you're making the right choice right now, and that's all that matters. I thought that was such an empathetic, interesting, compassionate choice, and I was so deeply bummed to see that final choice, which sells out the character, but also just, like you said, it doesn't really make sense. Just upload a new one. Make a new super Na'vi or something.
Which is why I feel like I think the way the movie is going or the series is going is that eventually Spider is going to be, originally the reason they create these avatars is to send humans into Na'vi society so that they could learn from them and hopefully find a diplomatic solution to the fact that the human race needs unobtainium and various other resources from Pandora, and the Na'vi, are rightly and fairly and justly and brutally defending their homeland. So how do we come to an agreement on this? And then eventually Quaritch is like, okay, Jake, you're going to go in. You're going to learn from the enemy. You're going to learn their ways so that we can more effectively destroy them from within. I think, if I'm right, I think that's what Spider is being set up to do. Spider, they are going to, like, Quaritch, eventually, they're going to move him aside. And the true villain... I hope this is what they're doing. This is actually what I hope that they're doing.
Yeah.
And that eventually Spider becomes that dagger pointed directly at the heart of the Na'vi, who understands their ways, who is raised amongst them,
That's
who
really
can speak
smart.
their language perfectly, who understands the way they think, the way their cultures work, the things they care about. And it's eventually in the further movie, in the the later sequels, Spider who is going to be the uber weapon of humanity that Jake never was, that Jake rejected. That's the only way this makes sense to me.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially there would be a lot of good, sad kind of irony in Spider in the 4th or 5th movie getting to become Na'vi and using an avatar himself and being able to achieve the one thing that he'd always wanted to achieve, but in a space where he's using it to destroy them. Also makes a lot of sense on a narrative level if we think about the fact that him and Kiri have this deep connection, and something this movie clearly sets up is it's almost implied that Kiri is sort of the daughter of Pandora. Like that Kiri is partially made of Pandora. Kiri can...
Right. She has a connection with the planet and the planet's like bioconsciousness.
Yeah.
That is, she's able to command the plant life and the animal life to attack like the human naval forces in a way that is clearly superhuman, super Navi.
Yeah. And super Navi, I like that. Yeah, and I think it would make a lot of sense because then you can have the inevitable conflict between Spider and Kiri. But the real truth is that at the end, Spider would likely come in the final moments, would make the right decision because Kiri is the person that he was connected with.
Now, if that is the case, if they are setting up Spider to eventually be like the uber villain of this series, I actually think now this is a really interesting. Now I'm really interested in this choice.
Now I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Because I think the implications of him saving him beyond the plot, because again, I think it doesn't matter for the plot because of the reasons we mentioned.
I like your point, the USB upload.
The implications are really interesting because like what happens when Spider tells them? Or does
That's
he?
what I'm thinking,
or does he
right?
not tell them?
I'm
does
assuming he doesn't tell them. That's
right.
And then that becomes the third movie is really about the conflict of them finding out and Quaritch being an active player, or you have a kind of situation where Quaritch is still injured and in the forest and Spider is secretly keeping him alive while they do this kind of greater battle against the Sky People.
I hope that is the case because this conversation reminds me a little bit of the Inarritu movie, The Revenant, starring Leo, which is a movie that I enjoyed for the spectacle, but also kind of disagreed with in the sense that, there's Leo's character. The movie didn't seem to understand that Leo's character, while a hero in the course of the story, is also like the vanguard of this European invasion that is like pressing its way into the heart of the indigenous lands. Like the fact that he is out there like looking for furs, and yes, he has a Mohawk wife, but the fact that he is out there leading people deeper and deeper and deeper into this territory, albeit in a peaceful way, is like forging the path for the conflict that is coming. And in that sense, like Jake and then Spider after him make you grapple with the question of, is there any way for a technologically advanced society to interact with a less technologically advanced society in a way that is at all equitable? Like, is there any way that those two groups can come to an understanding based on the values, knowledge, and material culture that they both have? And in that sense, like, again, if Spider is the villain, that's interesting. If it's just like a weird thing to keep the plot going, then I think this is terrible. But I'll be fascinated to see what happens when Jake and his family find out that fucking Spider, who they have been nothing but great to. Nothing but wonderful, loving.
They raised him.
They fucking raised this kid. They let him hang out with them, pull on their tails. He hisses like a Navi when he's threatened. When they find out that he saved the life of their greatest tormentor, I wonder what their reaction will be. I really do.
And we will get to find that out because Avatar 3, yet untitled, though we can probably guess it might have something to do with, fire or wind or something at this point.
Fire.
Air. Avatar, exactly. Things were all great until
Avatar
Fire
Way of
Nation
Air
came along. But Avatar 3 was actually filmed alongside this. So whatever happens, however this Avatar performs in this post-COVID landscape, Avatar 3 will come out. So we will find that. The question is whether it will perform well enough for Avatar 4 and 5 to be made. So whatever happens, we'll find out what happens in the third movie. And James Cameron, as he always is in his fox jacket, had a very cool, chill viewpoint on it. On the special I watched, where he was kind of like, audiences have changed. Things that people like have changed. Let's just see how it goes. I hope people connect with it. And if they don't, that's also okay. And
he doesn't care. He's like, this guy is so fucking rich.
Dude,
he has created, like with Titanic and Avatar, he has twice directed the biggest box
Also, let's
office
not
hit
forget,
ever in film
Terminator
history.
2 was like the most expensive movie ever made when it came out. And I
Yeah.
will just say, Spider does fit into, in my opinion, he is the worst version of. But look, Aliens, Newt. James Cameron
Yeah.
put a kid in there.
Yeah.
A little ragtag kid who needs
Also
to be
had
helped.
matted, dready hair.
The best version of that character, in my book, John Connor in Terminator 2. If you're making a James Cameron sequel, you got to have a small child. Sadly, Spider, he's low on the ranking for me of the James Cameron small child sequel trope. But yeah, I'll be very interested. I really like that. It's so funny how I never really thought I never really been like getting deep into like Avatar theories. You know, my theories
Yeah.
are very much in the comic book movie and action movie kind of franchise horror space. But I'm very invested in your Avatar theory. I think if that's the way they're leading, that could go somewhere pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that's when, you know, this story has been, again, it's pretty basic. It's all about the spectacle. Like, if you're looking like, oh my God, will I be spoiled by this? Don't worry about it. But if they go in that direction, I actually think, you know, the questions about like how a technologically advanced culture can interact with a more, you know, with a more naturalistic culture, I think is a really interesting one. And if they explore that via Spider, who I think is terrible, maybe that's pretty interesting. I'll be interested to see what happens.